When you think of a weapon of war, what comes to mind? Is it a tank? A missile? A bomb? A gun? Sure, these are all weapons and they've been used in some of the most devastating wars in history. But what about food? Why is it that when we think of weapons, we don't think about food deprivation? Russia is not only waging war against Ukraine, they are also waging war against their stomachs by attempting to use food as a weapon. Welcome back to Limitless. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon to never miss another update. That being said, let's begin. The Russian government has used similar tactics before, closing off roadways and borders in the past to destabilize the economy and undermine its enemies. Russia is literally trying to weaponize mass hunger like Stalin did in the 1930s. Ukraine and the Russian Federation provide about 30% of the world's wheat and barley, 1/5 of its maize, and more than half of its sunflower oil. Together, their grain feeds the poorest and most vulnerable people, providing more than 1/3 of the wheat imported by 45 African and least developed countries. The violence between these two countries has caused mass starvation and has created a major supply chain issue for the food industry. Russian troops have laid waste to farmland, destroying agricultural equipment and planting landmines in the rich soil where crops should grow. Ukraine's traditional supply routes have been wrecked, its ports now under Russian control. Does it mean the country's food supply will be cut off? According to the FAO, armed conflict is hurting agricultural production by keeping farmers from their fields and blocking access to inputs such as fuel, fertilizer, machinery, and seeds. Grain stocks are also dropping and the harvest season is coming up fast, which means that farmers will need to access their fields soon if they want to bring in a crop this year. The conflict has made it impossible for Ukrainians to grow and harvest crops, which has put their food supply chain in jeopardy. Many Ukrainians are left with nothing but their own words to try and stave off starvation. The only interpretation is that Russians want to create hunger and to use this method as a method of aggression. This is part of its larger campaign to force Ukraine into submission and block any efforts to move away from Russian influence and toward the European Union. Can you imagine what it's like to be one of the millions of Ukrainians who are left with no ability to feed themselves or their families? The attempted destruction of the food and agriculture sector in Ukraine is also a long-term threat to European markets and to the wider world. Some of the poorest nations in Africa and the Middle East face their own potential hunger crises in the months and years ahead if vital imports from Ukraine run out. Does Russia have the right to do this? Well, everything is fair in love and war? Moreover, the United States thinks it has only sanctioned Russia and its banks, but the United States has sanctioned the whole world. Russia has largely been unable to export food because of sanctions that have effectively cut it off financially. Ukraine, meanwhile, has been cut off physically. Russia has blocked the Black Sea for exports, and Ukraine lacks enough rail cars to transport food over land. The food supply chain is completely broken. There are other hurdles. The United States estimates that up to 30% of Ukrainian farmland could become a war zone, and with millions of Ukrainians fleeing the country or joining the front lines, far fewer can work the fields. Yes, this is happening in front of our eyes. Since global food markets were already strained by the COVID-19 pandemic, economists say the war's economic fallout has been particularly painful, and especially so for nations that are heavily dependent on Russia and Ukraine's supply. Various nations are trying hard to ensure that their citizens are not left hungry or are forced to pay high costs for food. They are doing this by cutting off food exports. Russian and Ukrainian wheat is not easily replaced. Inventories are already tight in the United States and Canada, while Moldova, a small exporter, has suspended shipments of wheat, corn, and sugar. Argentina is ensuring wheat supply to domestic millers to keep pasta prices under control. Indonesia has increased supply of palm oil by domestic producers to 30% from the earlier 20% as cooking oil prices have soared. Bulgaria, a large exporter, is working out a system to buy food grains to meet the needs of its citizens. Egypt, too, has banned exports of key agriculture products, including flour, lentils, and wheat. Russia itself has been taxing exports for some time now, while Ukraine has barred shipments of wheat, oats, and key staples to ensure its citizens do not go without food while fighting the Russians. The trade cutoff will ensure that food produced for the domestic market is not exported in view of surging global prices. What is going to happen next? The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that food prices could surge as much as 20%, a significant spike that could exacerbate global food insecurity. Nearly 283 million people in 81 countries currently face acute food insecurity or are at high risk, with 45 million on the brink of famine. Russia's invasion could be a tipping point into a world hunger crisis, and the entire global community will be hard hit by this. Rising food prices could also fuel political instability in import-reliant countries. Food prices and political unrest have historically been correlated with one another. A decade ago, skyrocketing grain costs, which drove bread prices up by 37% in Egypt, contributed to the Arab Spring. Earlier in 2008, increasing prices drove extreme global riots and protests. People will react when they're hungry, when the cost of food goes so high that they can't afford the rent. Surging prices have already sparked unrest in countries like Sudan, which imports more than 80% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. As bread prices rose, thousands of Sudanese activists faced tear gas and bullets to protest. In recent weeks, protests have also rocked Iraq and Greece, where hundreds of farmers protested against soaring fertilizer prices. This is really frustrating. If these economic shocks continue, the instability could spread to other regions around the world. It won't be just an Arab Spring. It won't be just North Africa. It would be a global disaster. Does that mean people will starve? The answer is probably yes. Almost 50 countries rely on Russia and Ukraine for at least 30% of their wheat imports, and 26 depend on them for more than half their imports. This is compounding an already bad situation. The real worry right now is that the perfect storm comes as we are still not out of the woods from all the massive economic displacement caused by the pandemic. If action is not taken soon, a food security crisis will be felt across the globe, beginning with the most fragile states and regions. It's going to have a dramatic impact on food costs, shipping costs, oil, and fuel. Just when you think it couldn't get worse, it's going to get worse. Now the real question: is there a way out of this crisis? The only lasting solution to the war in Ukraine and its assault on the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world is peace. As the United Nations works to support the innocent victims of this war, both inside and outside Ukraine, we appeal on the global community to speak with one voice and support our petition for peace. This war must end now. Well, that is all for today's video. We would love to hear from you. Is Putin really using hunger as a weapon? What do you think of this war and global food crises? Tell us in the comments section. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, consider subscribing, and turn on the notification icon to Limitless for more interesting videos every week. Until the next video, we wish you the best of health. Bye-bye.